Hello, 9 to 5ers. I'm Elizabeth Ajadi, host of 9 to 5 and everything in between. On today's episode, I have a special guest, John Boyes, an HR leader. We'll be discussing Hindsight 2024, a look back into end of the year performance evaluation and goal setting as a look forward. John Boyes is a human resources leader with a diverse legal, military, and operations management background. John serves double duty at Brookfield Properties and the U.S. Navy Reserve. His current role at Brookfield Properties is Director of HR Business Partnerships, Compensation, and HR Analytics. He leads the National HR Business Partnerships team and facilitates all aspects of compensation and data analytics. In the U.S. Navy Reserve, John is a commander, staff operations, and planning officer. He leads global joint exercises focused on counter-proliferation, anti-piracy, and maritime security. When he's not working his 9 to 5, he's an active duty to civilian career transition coach. And fun fact, while I was researching John, I discovered he holds a Juris Doctorate. So he is a man of many talents. One of the many things our podcast is about is 9 to 5 and everything in between. And John is an embodiment of that. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good to be here.
Yeah, of course. So John and I work together, and when I was thinking about this topic, hindsight 2024, I figured, what better person to really guide the conversation around looking back and then looking forward when it comes to preparing for that end of the year review. And so before we dive into the questions, I want John to just, in his own words, introduce himself, get to let the audience, let the listeners get to know you, and then they can just to set that tone and they understand that you're not just a guest, you're a subject matter expert when it comes to all things HR.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Wow, subject matter expert. I guess you get old enough, and then that starts to get the tag can get put on you. But
Right.
yeah, I appreciate the introduction and the walkthrough of my history. So I did join the Navy right out of after getting my law degree. Didn't go into practice right away, but I think went into like people leadership instead. So I've been doing that for over 16 years now. And my first introduction to like today's topic was really with the military, which is a pretty formal annual review process. Not a lot of goal setting, but they definitely evaluate you. And then skipping right into like the business sector when I got off active duty and came back to Cleveland, Ohio, and then found my way into HR after a couple operations leadership roles, and kind of quickly made my
I wanted to interrupt real quick
yeah.
there. So how long is that timeline, between starting and then getting off active duty?
Yeah, I was an active duty surface warfare officer for 4 years. So that's on the ships, driving the ship, leading people, and everything that kind of goes along with that. So pretty cool, experience for a young person. Maybe not for someone trying to start a family. That was one of the reasons I didn't stick with active duty. Was the lack of family stability I saw. The people who led me. Um, but yeah, so 4 years of that, 12 years in the reserves now. And after, I would say, 3 years of figuring out what I wanted to do when I grew up in the private sector, I started working in HR, and I've been doing that for 8 years now at three different companies. So I think that's one, I think, a good thing in this aspect to give you a different flavor of performance management in three different HR departments, because it really
Okay.
is. And I think some of the things we'll talk about today, a lot of the answers
Correct.
depend on your own organization and how they approach the topic.
This is very true. This is very true because, like, in the previous organization that I worked at, like, the approach to performance evaluation is very different to how current company does it. So, I think it's also part of the culture of the organization. I think
Yeah.
it drives that a great deal in just overall what the organization is looking for in its employees.
Sure. Yeah. So much of it comes down to like what uh, an organization puts on the leader, like in this
Mm,
process. I think there's what's written or talked about, and then what happens in practice, which sometimes
right,
isn't the same thing. So, I mean, I think mid-career professionals have to navigate both of those things when it comes to the
right.
topic.
Right, absolutely. I want to double click a little bit because I wanted people to understand. You've definitely had an amazing career, both in the Navy Reserve and then in corporate, and somehow you still balance both, really, and you still manage to work as a career transition coach. And you hit on something that I talk about a lot, is that it takes time really to figure out what direction that you want to move in, as far as like knowing where you want to take your career. And you did mention that you took 3 years to really figure that out. And,
Yeah,
for young professionals, we spend a lot of time belaboring or even stressing over where we want to be and feeling like we're behind, but not realizing everybody's figuring it out as they go along as well.
yeah, that's absolutely true. Good observation. Like military transition definitely is a unique one. That's where I spend some of my time as a volunteer, as you mentioned, helping people figure out that what I'm going to do in my next life piece. But I think
Right.
some of the lessons that I tell those people absolutely apply to, early professionals, maybe just getting out of college or just getting into the workforce and balancing that. What I see is like that wanting to find a sense of meaning in your work and doing practical things that will build your career. And sometimes you
Mm,
sacrifice one for the other. But I think that comes down to like a mindset of growth and wherever you're at, finding like the value in learning, whether that
right.
it could even be you're learning how not to run an organization or things that you wouldn't want to do as a leader or as an organization. That definitely like I had more like don't do this leadership lessons in the Navy than I did. But I had some very impactful, positive ones that have very much stuck with me.
Right.
So,
Right.
but yeah,
Right.
my first job out of the Navy was awful. I was there for 13 months. I definitely learned more than I knew at the time
Yeah.
from that experience. So
Yeah.
sometimes the first opportunity as you're trying to get your career going doesn't have to be perfect, but if you can
Correct.
see value in what you're learning from both a positive and negative aspect, in the end, it could be a step you didn't actually know you were taking.
I love that so very much because actually my first job right out of college was pretty awful too. And but you know what? I look back at that time period as a period where I learned to be a little bit more resilient, and I learned to just roll with the punches. And
Sure.
I'm so grateful to I had a mentor. I still have a mentor. Um, who really held my hand throughout that process. It was a very difficult time, and I was very young too. So, I was ready to throw in the towel, and he's like, "Nope, you're sticking here, and we just need to figure out where you're going next." And so, I appreciate that, and that's actually a very good segue into performance evaluation
Sure.
because a lot of what we talk about when it comes to performance evaluation has to do with how you um, just grading you as an employee. And you think you go through school life and you experience life in college, um, from a very young age you're going through an education and you get grades at the end of every term or semester, and you think, okay, once I graduate it's done. However, you enter into the workforce and they're like, oh yeah, you have to do these annual evaluation where you talk about what you did, and your manager in turn tells you what they think about what you did. And so it's quite interesting, that perspective, that learning never ends and evaluation never truly ends. Um, so first question that I have for you is, what is the typical timeline for end of the year performance review process?
Yeah. So You mean like the full calendar, like timeline of it, or just like
Yeah,
finishing it
the full
up?
timeline of
Yeah.
it. Like, when should I expect it as an employee? Is it like mid-year? Is the end of the year? Um, how long should I typically have to think about it?
Great question. So, yeah, most organizations are on an annual calendar. Like you're going to have a goal setting phase, perhaps a mid year or multi like checkpoints throughout the year, like formal feedback checkpoints in that process, and then a
Right.
year end review. Some of your listeners might be part of a really progressive organization that has gotten rid of year end reviews. That was
Mm,
definitely a thing for a while there. Um, but I think the principles of like how to behave within like that performance management environment are kind of the same in terms of leaning in to feedback from your manager,
right.
participating in a lot of the steps of the process. But yeah,
Mm,
you see that year end review take place. I would say anywhere between October and February, and you kind of have to
okay.
be okay with that depending on the organization because usually there's an awkwardness to it where the review period is over and I'm waiting some period of time to find out what the result is, or it's happening technically before the period is over, and you might have some heartburn
Right.
about how can you evaluate me when there's a month left. But usually it ties into a whole bunch of other things that also have to keep marching
Yeah.
along in the organization.
Yeah, yeah, I used to think about that, but I eventually reconciled myself to the fact that, well, how much can I really get done in the last month of the year that I haven't been working on all year,
Mm-hmm.
really? A lot of things are tying up loose ends at the end of the year anyway. So I never see that last month as like, oh, I could still finish up this huge project. We can just say, yeah, I know I'm definitely going to complete it. Especially, I think for my background, I've always been um, more project based, and a lot of my work is pretty measurable in that I have
Mm-hmm.
timelines and deadlines tied to a lot of things that I work on. And but for some people, it's not always the case, really. So
Right.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think that too, in like terms of maybe like a basketball analogy, is like if you're trying to make like the three pointer as the buzzer expires to win the game, then you probably did something wrong in the first quarter. So it
Right.
all kind of comes down to open communication with your manager, keeping them up to date on where you're at with things, even if they aren't asking for it. So there's
Mhm.
no surprises at year end.
Yeah, and that's where I typically talk about doing one-on-ones, either on a weekly or bi-weekly basis as
Yep.
a touch point, a more regular touch point. So there's no surprises on either side of the aisle for employee and the manager.
Definitely a best practice.
Yeah, for sure. So next question is like, who will be conducting the performance review? Who's involved in this review process?
Yeah, so typically it better be, I would say, your manager who you report into that has knowledge of your work. Some folks might have a manager who has very little to do with their work, which I think that
Mm,
gets back to the having those one-on-ones, keeping them informed of, even if you're not active in the day-to-day, process of my work. Here's who thinks I'm doing well, or these are my
right.
constituents that you might want to talk to at your end to know how I'm doing. And then,
Yeah.
depending on the organization, HR could be involved in looking at performance calibration in terms of
Okay.
maybe looking at the number of high ratings that are given out by the organization and calibrating that to
Right.
I've had organizations that have quotas on that really do lock it down, where a manager can't have more than 15, 20% in that
Interesting.
top category, and others that maybe have like a soft goal, but a
Right.
manager might know if they have a team that's rated very highly, they might run
Yeah.
into issues at compensation time.
I see. I mean, what do you do when you have an organization that hires top performance across the board? Really?
Yeah, I mean, well, you got to have separation, and I think like in terms of goal setting and defining what is like
Mhm.
considered above and beyond,
Yeah.
very well, is really sets the like kind of the tone for that.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely agree. I had a manager once who we would set regular goals, but we also set stretch goals as well, and that was definitely very helpful in at least outlining what I needed to do to be considered above and beyond. So I
Yeah,
appreciate that for sure.
but yeah,
So,
that's a good problem to have. If you're, I'd rather have that than a organization of underperformers.
right. Oh God, yeah, absolutely. Nightmare for hiring and budgets. Oh wow, don't even want to get into that one. Um, okay, so what is the format of the review process? Is it expected to be in person? Is it expected to be written? Or like, can it be virtual, like we're conducting this interview?
Yeah, like I lead a hybrid team. Some associates here at our corporate office in this town, some that are across the country. So I think
Okay,
you kind of have to be prepared for either one. I'd say if you
right,
can have it in person, I think it's best to eliminate like any element of miscommunication in these conversations.
right.
Face to face in the same room, I think usually avails the best kind of
Y-
format for that. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Or even video,
yeah.
so at least you're able
Oh,
to
absolutely.
read.
I mean, that's a given in this day and age, right? If your
I mean,
manager
some
is
people don't like to
conducting
turn on
your,
their
yeah,
video.
I would have, that's a red flag to me. If your manager won't turn on their video for your performance review, I'd probably be, I wouldn't like that.
I would
Um,
go to my HR
yeah.
business partner
Yeah, there you go.
immediately.
That's what we're here for. But yeah, hopefully there's a written component to it too, though. I could see, small organizations might be very, um, you know, uh, maybe informal, but most
Right.
organizations, I think there's a written component to it that hopefully you
Mm,
participated in building throughout the year so you know
yeah.
what to expect to talk about.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So, I mean, switching into more like performance indicators, people talk about KPIs a lot. And I
Hmm.
feel like you've already touched on this a little bit, from the beginning of the year, you're setting goals. So, like, there's definitely key performance indicators. So, how should a person expect to be evaluated as far as like, how should they expect the feedback?
Yeah. So like I would like when you join an organization, I would ask those questions first of all from your manager because most of the time, we're not joining cleanly like on January 1st at the beginning of a performance cycle, right? So you kind of want
Right.
to understand what's the process here? Where are we at in the process?
Right.
And, how do I join it mid-year? But then you could be looking at like, is it literally a blank sheet of paper there's maybe some guidance on how to fill it in, but it's more of
Mm-hmm.
a blank slate, which I would maybe go look for some resources
Right.
maybe online on how to do that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but most likely, if you're in like a kind of a mature organization, you're either going to have like a section of goals, perhaps a section of competencies that
Right.
kind of work together to inform a year end outcome. But
Okay.
yeah,
That makes sense. You said something that got me curious about it. Is this something that possibly when I'm interviewing, I can ask, like, is what
oh,
is the
certainly.
process for
Yeah,
evaluation?
I've absolutely been asked that in interviews
Okay.
before in terms of
Yeah, because
like,
I definitely ask that, to be
it's
honest.
a good question. Yeah,
Okay. All right, cool. Because, going in, especially you just mentioned, like, if it's off cycle, like, I'd like to know. And some people take it as use it to negotiate, even like, okay, I know I'm starting in May, but I still want to be considered for a full year
sure.
evaluation and potentially that raise. So, yeah,
Yeah, and if I can't,
definitely.
is there a sign on bonus that makes up for that? Right. So,
Exactly, exactly. I like that. I like that. So as an individual, how can I prepare for this conversation? Because obviously, a year is a long time to really condense into this um, document that I have to like type my evaluation. So how do I prepare for
mhm.
um, this conversation with my leader?
Yeah. So first of all, if you have a self-evaluation process, even if a company says it's optional, you absolutely should participate in that. You
Okay.
know, to me, it's a missed opportunity not to put down on the paper what you think were your top achievements for the year,
Yeah.
and talk to any anticipated negative feedback or criticism on a project that you had.
Right.
Not to explain it away. I would never not want someone to show accountability in
Yeah.
in one of these conversations, but you can get ahead of the narrative, I think. But
Right.
also don't wait till year end to like focus on this question. Like as you do goal setting, if you think that your objectives have shifted through the year, which
Yeah.
often it does, like the process to get there should be a living document. And if the priority of the organization shifts, your department shifts, then you want to have a conversation with your manager, like at that
Right.
time, to update your review
For your
to
goals.
reflect
Yeah.
the change in direction. So yeah, to
Right.
me, it's start preparing for your year end review when you write your goals, and don't lose sight of them throughout the year. So when you get to that conversation at the year end, um, hopefully your self review and preparing for that conversation is pretty seamless.
Yeah, I appreciate that for sure because I mean, I've worked in organizations where we only do the one a year end one, but I've also worked in organizations where we do a mid year and an end of the year. And so we look at that mid year as a recalibration of goals and really redirection on what the focus is. And
Mhm.
half the time or most of the time it's almost a complete rewrite from what I put in January, and what I would have to change it to in mid-year July because priorities have shifted and some things are just deemed unachievable or now obsolete, depending on what the direction is for the department.
Sure, I've
Yeah,
absolutely experienced that too.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Now to the feedback portion of this because different people definitely get wary of this of the conversation more so because of having to provide feedback and receiving feedback. So,
Mhm.
touching on negative feedback first, it's easy to say thank you when they say you're doing a great job. But like when it's negative feedback, how can I respond or how should I respond to negative feedback in a constructive manner that allows me to not just respond in a defensive way, but be able to be constructive about it?
Yeah, I like the adjectives you use there, constructive and defensive. Like two
Yeah,
things that I think focus on, if you're getting negative feedback, hopefully it's not a surprise,
yeah,
and you've been having check-ins, so you know that there might be something out there that you need to work on.
right.
So the formal discussion, I think, is the time to ask those questions, to really seek to understand um, what the organization views as lacking in your performance, and ask if there's more people uh, to go and discuss that with.
Okay.
Because I mean, there is like a very kind of practical matter to this. And sometimes I tell associates, you can't fight City Hall. Like
Hmm.
if there's not a policy violation happening here, and maybe you don't agree with the perception of your work, you do have to deal with that perception. The old adage, like perception is reality.
Yeah.
So leaning into that, asking questions about it, not being defensive up front and deciding off the bat that it doesn't apply to you, and
Yeah.
I think you got to take some time to really reflect and say, like, is this true? Are there things I'm doing that I could change in terms of my approach to a situation or how I collaborate
Yeah.
with others, perhaps? But at the end of the day, like maybe that organization is not for you. If you do
Right.
reflect on it and find that you don't agree with it, um, but if you do feel like, hey, this is legit, like maybe I did have a misstep this year, then I
Yeah.
think you need to lean into it and really commit to growth. And I've
Right.
seen associates really take a growth mindset to this type of feedback before, and then they go not from their manager, but perhaps others that were involved in a situation, and say,
Yeah.
hey, I got feedback in my year-end review.
Yeah.
I'm working on my communication. I'd like you to be my partner in getting better in that area. Can you
Mm,
please let me know if you see me doing XYZ this year? Because I want to work on that.
yeah. I
And
like
then,
that.
yeah, then you're creating a network of support and showing the organization that you're open
Right.
to feedback and growth.
Oh, I love that a lot because obviously there's people that maybe you admire in the organization and you see, you appreciate their feedback and, would definitely maybe believe what they say to you.
Sure. Or
And you
people
know
you
that they
know,
won't.
yeah, people you know you need to win over. Maybe
Yes,
they were a
that's a
critic
good
of
one.
yours and you end up winning them over by saying, I hear you. I want to work on it. Will you help me?
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that a lot. I actually have a B side to that question. It's more
Sure.
on, if I think we've just answered this from the perspective of manager to employee. What if it's from a peer?
Mm. So
Because
negative feedback from a peer.
yeah, these are
That
always a hard pill to swallow, to be
sure.
honest.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us are getting feedback that we should lead both up and down the organization, but also across.
Yeah,
Um, I've always been told that if someone gives you feedback, the first thing that comes out of your mouth should be thank you. Because that person is either, blindly emboldened to just tell people what they think, or they thought about that a lot. And it probably took some courage for them to have that conversation with you. Um,
yeah,
I've had some peer relationships in my career where giving each other feedback has led to both of us becoming better HR leaders and actually growing friendships where at the beginning didn't think there'd be one. So I think the lean in kind of advice applies there too, and be gracious for
yeah,
feedback.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because it's nerve wracking for the giver of the feedback and the receiver of the
Mhm.
feedback.
Absolutely.
I've definitely been in that in both positions from the peer perspective. So now, from the employee to manager, how can I provide constructive feedback up to my manager, but managing up here?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think like sharing observations
Yeah,
that are specific um, are really good in this space. I would say knowing that you have a trusting and open relationship to start.
yeah,
If some of you might or your listeners might just know it's a non-starter
yeah.
and it's not an effective use of your time, depending on who your manager is. I think
This is true.
that's a strategic decision where you might you know uh,
You're like,
prioritize
never mind.
survival over honesty, right? Um,
Yeah,
but like I think if you know that door is cracked open there, and you can do that in an effective way with a concrete example of something maybe you observed that could have gone better, or
hmm,
maybe you saw something in a meeting they didn't, how they were perceived and whatnot.
yeah,
You can gain a lot of trust with your leader if you have the courage to do that.
yeah,
And it could eventually turn into a situation where your manager is asking you, how did that go? Like,
hmm,
did that meeting go as well as I thought it did? How could it have gone better? Um,
right, right,
like,
right.
and that's where I've seen some uh, associates that are in that sense developing their manager, right? Giving them feedback, helping
Yeah,
them be better, um,
yeah,
get upset or why should I be having to do this, for my
hmm,
manager? Well, I think it all comes around full circle, right? You're building
correct.
trust, and one day you're going to be a manager, and hopefully you reflect on that experience and you ask
Yeah.
your own team for that feedback.
Absolutely. I actually appreciate that a lot because I've definitely had moments where I had feedback and I think, you know what? Never mind. It's not worth it because I know it would take me down a path that um, uh, uh, I'm not ready to explore versus like having a leader where I feel very comfortable with them and we respect each other. We've been able to develop that mutual respect in that they appreciate when I say, oh, that was excellent, but it could have been better in this way.
Sure.
And I think one thing I appreciate about feedback is when it's not vague, when it's very specific and spot on, it allows me to work on it rather than assume or try to figure out what I should be doing better.
Yeah, I had a situation like where this came up in my career that I think took a lot of courage, but in the end, and was uncomfortable in the moment, but in the end, helped me out a lot. Where I was
Yeah.
working on a project with a one of my boss's peers, and
Hmm.
at the end of the project, she asked me for feedback on how it went, and I remember I told her I said, um, I think you manage up really well, and like
Yeah.
our project was well received because the executive team was well informed and had crisp
Yeah.
presentations and everything. But the managing down aspect, the leader was seemed out of touch. Didn't was uh, overly polished with the team where you want to be more
Uh,
bring your informal self out and
yeah. Yeah.
work shoulder to shoulder. And she was defensive in the moment. And the next week she met with me and said, "Hey, I got to say I'm sorry and thank you for the feedback." And from that point forward, we had an amazing working relationship, and she became a champion of mine. So
See
yeah,
how you gained a sponsor right there.
exactly. So I think that's I thought she'd be receptive to it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
even so her first instinct what probably wasn't right, but she
Right.
reflected on the feedback and thought that it was valuable enough to come back and say thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that a lot because for me personally, when I'm giving feedback, I typically don't like to respond in the moment. I like to let it sink in, and I say things like, you know what, I hear you, and I would like to reflect on this, and I will get back to you with my thoughts. Some things maybe, okay, I already know or I'm
Hmm.
aware of it, and I can, appreciate it in the moment. But some things, if it hits me from the left side, I'm like, whoa, like
Yeah,
I, I don't know how to react right now. I need a moment.
so the power of reflective thinking.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I want to segue us into goal setting because I feel like we've really talked deeply about performance evaluation and how to give feedback and how to receive feedback and really how to prepare for that. But like, now looking forward, goal setting is important to what is in hindsight, really, And so how can I, as an individual and employee, prepare for a discussion about my professional development and career aspirations. We've talked about what I could be doing better, and I'm looking forward in the new year. And I know I want to do certain things better. How can I have that conversation?
Yeah, and hopefully, like your manager's asking you that. But if
Mm,
they aren't, um, asking for time to talk about your development and career aspirations, I think, is something anyone should feel um, like they're entitled to that conversation with their manager. And,
okay.
I think being very honest about where you see yourself and where you'd like to be is a good place to start. And then asking for your manager for feedback on like what would that path look like at this organization,
Yeah.
to understand like the different career ladders that could get you there. You might be thinking of it in a very linear way, but
Yeah.
maybe your manager thinks you should moonlight in another department for 2 years in a developmental role before you move into the perhaps the manager role that you have your eye on. But I think
Mm,
saying what you want is a good thing. But
right. Right.
but pairing it with reasonable expectation, I think, protects you from seeming, over eager or wanting to skip a step and whatnot.
Yeah.
I remember
I
one,
love that.
yeah, and then you might get some feedback in what you need to work on to get there, which is really what you want to be seeking in a conversation like that. Not like when can I have this? It's what should I be working on to get there.
Right. Oh, yeah. I love that. I like that term, reasonable expectation,
Hmm.
because, not to like, talk about certain groups of people, you have certain groups of individuals coming into the workforce and they really think, oh, they should be promoted
Oh,
immediately after first year.
sure.
And it's like, yeah, you should be promoted, but like it doesn't work that way.
Right.
There's layers to it, there's steps to it. And um, I feel like you said it, managers, leaders, they typically have bird's eye view of like where the organization is going, if the organization is going to pivot, if there's likelihood to maybe even cut staff or even switch gears, move, shift objectives. And so, they know if that path that you're thinking about is not necessarily a viable option for you. Maybe it would be outside of the organization, and that's a separate
Sure.
conversation.
Yeah, growth happens that way too.
Yeah, yeah,
But I
yeah.
had like a personal story on this uh, topic that I think is really good for people to hear. Like I was in my first HR like leadership role, and my manager left the organization. I thought to myself, boy, they're gonna call me. Like I'm gonna get promoted, and it didn't happen. So they had a reorg, and I got a new manager.
Mm,
And I worked for her for some time, and she left the organization. And I was like, this is it. I'm going to go talk to the director. I'm going to say,
yeah,
I'm ready and I want the job. And he
yeah.
asked me 3 or 4 questions about my readiness for the role. And I walked out of that conversation knowing exactly what I had to do and what my gap
Mm,
was to be ready for that
right.
role. And
Yeah,
I took that feedback and put it in action right away.
yeah, yeah.
So going and having that conversation with reasonable expectation allowed me to
Yeah.
see some gaps I didn't know I had, and then
Mm-hmm.
go exercise those, and then have that conversation with the director about it.
Mm. Being a continuous improvement person here, I clicked on that gap analysis,
Sure.
you know, even maybe even having a more direct uh conversation and asking the question like, here's where I am, here's where I want to be. And what do you think from a leadership perspective I need to get there?
Yeah.
I think is a more direct approach to even ask the question, especially if you both acknowledge that, yeah, you could probably be there in 2 years, but so here's what you can do to close that gap in
Yep.
that time frame. All right, cool. So for goal setting, what is the process really? You mentioned when we're talking about evaluation, some companies typically have a formal process, or you can Google it. But
Sure.
what do you recommend here?
Yeah. So hopefully you have an organization that is letting you know where you're going in
Yeah,
terms of setting like a annual or perhaps a 5 year roadmap that really talks about strategic objectives, what the priority is, and how people fit into that.
yeah,
I think best in class organizations are putting that out, perhaps on an annual basis, and then
mm-hmm,
allowing a department to then take it and localize it for their leaders to provide to their
yeah,
team members to make goals that align to the company's objectives. Now,
right,
you might be in an organization that's not that organized, right?
yeah,
But I think there are things you can do to discern, what did your CEO talk about in the last town hall?
yeah.
Are they making public statements if you're a public company in terms of where they're going? Um, you know,
Great point.
discern where the organization is going. Think about how you fit into that like
Yeah,
kind of roadmap, and you should build goals that align to those objectives. I think if you can
yeah,
point to like each of your goals and then talk about why it relates to where the organization is going, you're
mm-hmm.
probably in a very good place to say,
Position. Yeah.
I'm working on things that are important to the company.
Yeah. You know what? You've answered my next two questions, honestly, because it's about aligning your goals with the company's objectives. And a tip that I have for listeners is really I keep an annual spreadsheet where, I know what the three big objectives of the organization is. And I then take what I want to do, the sub break it down if into like, okay, maybe this is what I can do to um, add revenue or grow revenue for the
Mm-hmm.
organization, or maybe even reduce spend, which inherently increases revenue. And then what projects am I working on? What things am I working on? and that's more measurable and specific, but it ties back to the objectives of the organization.
Yep.
My next question, how often should I review my progress? Uh, how often will the progress of my goals be reviewed? Like, am I supposed to look at it on a monthly basis? You mentioned 5-year roadmap, and I'm like, whoa, I don't know about that.
Yeah, for your own like personal goals, I think tailor it to the organization's performance process first of all, right?
Yeah,
If you have a mid-year review and a year end, at a minimum, you want to be preparing for that. But if you have a 3-month project, I think by all means, as something like that is wrapping up, either
yeah,
document it in your OneNote, or
yeah,
if you have like an open performance management format, go document it there as it
right,
happens. So you're completing that, and not having to remember it at year end.
right,
But
right.
one thing I do for myself and for my teammates throughout the years, I keep what the Navy called a brag sheet. And as
Ah,
I do something I think is good, or whenever my team does something I think that's brag worthy, is I'll
yeah.
open a separate notebook for them and jot down, on February 20th, Johnny really nailed it in this meeting, and got positive feedback from the president. So that way,
I love that.
yeah, January when I'm writing the year end, 11 months
You can,
later, I can
yeah.
reflect on that more easily as a manager.
Oh, that is so amazing. I would reach out to you for your brag sheet template, please. And
Absolutely.
if you give me the permission, I can share it on the 9 to 5 Blueprint website for listeners to download
Yeah.
as well and use to keep their own brag sheet. My final question for today is, what resources are available to help me set and achieve my goals? So, like, it sometimes sounds like, oh, yeah, it should be easy, but am I able to go to my HR business partner? Like, am I able to just go to HR and say, I need help? I don't really know how to work on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I would very much hope that like your HR department at any organization can be helpful in that regard. I've been at a couple organizations in the past where we actually held goal setting training for all associates,
Mm,
open forum, any level of the organization, where I think some organizations might only focus on training the managers on the process. And you might think of it as a process only for people leaders to engage in. But I would think your HR business partner should absolutely be able to like help you say, am I crafting the goals here in the format that the organization likes?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Having a conversation with your leader up front, how do you like
yeah,
a performance review to be organized? If it's more free
yeah,
form, that's a great question to ask.
yeah,
And there's a
yeah,
lot of great content online. I mean, just
for
like this
sure.
podcast, that can help you find best practices, smart format for goal setting,
Yeah,
those types of things.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Oh my God, this has been such an insightful conversation.
Oh,
I
thank
could go
you.
on and
It's
on
been
and
fun.
on. Uh, I know it's so relaxed and just easy conversation. So before we wrap up, I wanted to just ask, looking into 2025, because it's already almost like 1 week into November, um, what should professionals be thinking about? They're thinking about goal setting, they're thinking about their career. What's your outlook on, just corporate career in today's work, for today's workforce?
No, that's a good question. I think, your career's in your hands. You have to kind of have a open discussion with your manager about what you want to do, where you want to
Yeah,
go, what you see your next step as, and what the company sees your next step as. And if not, I think it's still a period of low unemployment and high number of job openings, to
yeah,
where two of my best growth experiences happened by changing companies for a very similar role. but just the
Mm,
change and learning how a new company does it, establishing relationships again,
yeah.
building that relationship capital that I like to call,
Yeah.
and proving to yourself that you can do that in a different organization is
Great.
going to be that can be a form of growth as well. Um,
Yeah.
so I still think there's a market today where employees
Mm-hmm.
have a little bit more power than the employer. Don't know how long
Mm,
that'll last, but yeah, for the risk takers, I think there's an opportunity to look into that as well.
yeah, for sure. Honestly, your first sentence almost mirrors my closing sentence. And so I really appreciate that perspective. It's like, looking forward, there's a lot of opportunities. Don't feel tied down to like where you are, and just explore, look at other organizations, look at other industries. Don't feel like you only know how to do healthcare. I was in healthcare and I work in real estate industry now. And, I never imagined myself here, but here I am 3 years later and thriving in this industry. So definitely great advice to look forward. So one thing that I want to say is thank you so much, John. This is being amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and the insights that you've provided. Um, Somebody tells me like you learn twice when you teach, and I feel like I've learned a ton from you on this. Some of the things that I know, so you've affirmed a lot of things that I know, and some new things as well. So to the listeners, don't forget that you are the architect of your own journey, and 9 to 5 and everything in between is here to engage, educate, and empower you. You can listen to 9 to 5 and everything in between on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music. You can also watch the visual on YouTube. So don't forget to follow us on our social media platforms: LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok at the 9 to 5 Blueprint uh, for news on upcoming episodes. So definitely a lot of great things in store for listeners. So thank you for tuning in. See you on the next one.